Mr. Speaker and members, I rise today on behalf of the California Legislative Black Caucus as the Vice Chair of that caucus to present to you ACR 139, a resolution commemorating Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. As many of you know, Dr. King was born on January 15th, 1929, and raised in the South by a father who was a Baptist minister. And at a very early age, he felt he had the calling also to become a minister. However, as most things do, life changes you, and as a result, you take on new challenges. So that in 1954, when he was when he was a minister in Montgomery, Alabama, at the Ebenezer Baptist Church, he then began to deal with the issue of segregation when it was brought to him by a group of citizens that Rosa Parks had been thrown off the bus, and that it was now time for people to think about the issue of segregation and Jim Crow laws that had existed in this country for a century. Dr. King was only 26 years old when he decided that this was his work, that he would take up this enormous challenge in the era of tremendous racism and lynchings and burnings and intimidation. Dr. King decided that this was worth dedicating his life to, and he engaged in the most successful boycott for over 13 months in Montgomery, Alabama, that basically broke the back of segregation in buses and integrated the bus system in Montgomery. That propelled him forward as a leader in this nation in the area of civil rights. And they formed the Montgomery Improvement Association and began at that point to talk about all the other areas of segregation and discrimination in this nation. Much of you remember his great speech in 1963, that I Have a Dream, where over 250,000 people came to Washington to protest against the segregation in this nation. It resulted in the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In 13 years, this young man changed the direction and the life and the culture of this country. And there was an effort initially to obviously give him a celebration, a birthday. That was resisted for a number of years. But we should be proud in California that in 1970, California became the first state to actually have a Martin Luther King Jr. celebration and holiday in all of its schools and public facilities. So we're here today to commemorate the life and legacy of Dr. King. And as we think about that, Dr. King would have been 89 years old on Monday. He's been dead longer than he lived in terms of dying at the age of 39, a young man who dedicated his whole life to what was right, what was just. And I asked us today to commemorate him in the passage of ACR 139. You know, I was trying to think of what I was going to say today to close out this celebration. This is probably my 6th time speaking on this floor concerning Martin Luther King. And one thing that came to me is a realization that come this April, it would have been 50 years since Dr. Martin Luther King lived, that he was assassinated on April the 4th, 1968, when I was a student at UCLA. And then I realized that probably in this house, most of you never had the opportunity to really see a live presentation of Dr. King. Most of you are not 50 years old. So your knowledge of him is knowledge that has been transferred down from those who were there, or books or articles or newspapers. But I'm not sure if you really grasp how difficult the challenge was in his lifetime. As most of you know, I was born in Hope, Arkansas, and my family is still there, many of them. But we traveled there often, and so I had the unique opportunity of living in California with the kinds of things that we think are wonderful amenities in terms of race relations in comparison to the South. But I traveled to the South quite often, and I saw the signs of white and colored. I understood the inconvenience of trying to find a restroom to use at a service station. I knew what it was like to drive for 24 hours and not be able to stop because there was no place you could stop to stay. And if you stopped, you were afraid of what you might see once you crossed out of California and crossed Arizona. You didn't know what you would see once you reached Texas and beyond. And so I understand, so many of us we have a sense about it, but maybe not a sense of how important it was and how deep it was in the society, the hatred that was there, that had been built up over 200 years of hatred, and how that permeated every element of a person's life, defining where they went, how they lived, where they ate, where they stayed, how far they could go or not go in a society, in a community. And that became really a difficult thing to transfer sometimes to young people. The fact that this battle we're in is a battle, it's a life battle that you can't really relax on, you can't give up on. Because it was difficult for them climbing that mountain of discrimination, trying to get to some freedom and some justice at the top, knowing that every step was difficult and every step might mean your life, but it is real easy to roll down a hill without thinking. You know, the racism in this country was built up over decades. When the first slaves were brought here in the 1600s, no one thought that there would be this enormous system of discrimination. And little by little, law by law, attitude by attitude, we end up with the worst slave system in the history of the world. One that was just not about an individual being enslaved, but generations and generations and generations of people who were owned by others with the right to abuse or misuse in any capacity that they thought. And so that happened little by little. And so when Emancipation Proclamation comes in 1863, and the war ends in 1865, you have a sense of freedom for about 15 years during Reconstruction. And then little by little, law by law, attitude by attitude, that began to change till we ended up with the new system called Jim Crow. And I say this because sometimes we think people ride into these issues, you know, full-fledged with a program and a process that they can put out there without realizing that step by step, piece by piece, you build this system of discrimination and hatred. And so I recognize that many of you were not a part of that. You get it, but you're not empathizing with it because it's not really something that you saw, that you live with, that you work with. And you didn't know how proud we were when we saw Dr. King at a rally or march, and how courageous he was when he came to San Diego, and even the ministers in San Diego would not let him speak at their churches because they were afraid of white backlash. And so as a result, he spoke at San Diego State University in the gym because they would not let him speak at the largest Black Baptist church in San Diego because they were afraid of this radical who might cause trouble, who may make problems and difficulty for them. And so when I began to ask myself as we look at this and say, you know, there's a generation that you don't have that experience. You have the knowledge of it, which makes this day even more important. Because without this celebration, without this day, you could afford to not even think about Martin Luther King and all the struggles that we've been through. And it's really important because as we face this new challenge, we are now faced with a challenge that is enormous in this nation. A challenge to basically be Americans, to hold fast to the values and the principles that we believe in, that are under attack every day as we get the hate message that spews out against different immigrants and different individuals. And while we might think, oh, that sounds not so bad, but the reality is, it is bad. It gets to the heart of what this nation fought for and what it's supposed to be. And it is individuals like us who don't make statements, who don't rock the boat, who don't move the waters, who quietly say, I don't agree, but you don't stand up and shout. You don't stand in your communities and say, stop it. We cannot have that. That is not who we are. And so King often said, it's not the words of my enemies that bother me, it's the silence of my friends. It's the fact that we don't speak up. We don't speak out. We don't condemn those things. When I see what's on television now, when I see Charlottesville and the alt-rights and the white nationalist movement and all that, I'm wondering, where are my friends? Where are my colleagues who ought to be standing up and shouting and screaming to the top of their voice? Because we have come too far, fought too long and too hard to be pulled back into this darkness of hate and ugliness in this nation. And so as we look at the Dr. King Day, I am hopeful that people will begin to see something in themselves that causes them to rise up and to say, not on my watch, not while I'm here, not in my community, not in my nation. And that bothers me more than anything, because oftentimes you see the things that occur, but you ask the question, where are the folks who are going to fight against it, who don't believe in it but won't open their mouths? And the beauty of the Martin Luther King Celebration Day is that it once again reminds us that one person standing for right can truly change the world. One person with the determination to motivate others to join them can change the world. And he often says, if you don't have anything you're willing to die for, you really have nothing to live for. If these principles that are truly American principles of how we treat each other, how we respect the values that we have in this nation, how we protect our children, and the legacy we pass on to them is so extremely important. And so I challenge us today to be that America, as our poet once said, that never was, but yet must be. The nation that says it embraces everyone, but has yet to do it. The nation that is supposed to provide opportunities for everyone and has not. I challenge us to be that nation that King talked about, the mountaintop and the experience that he could stand and see the promised land. That many of us have begun to walk back down that mountain. Why? Because it's a familiar trail and it's convenient. And it is hard work to be free. It is hard work, even harder work to stay free. And I challenge you today to remember always that hatred is something that we don't want. But justice, equality, opportunity is a rare flower that requires constant treatment and nurturing and care. But hatred is a weed, and it grows best in neglect. And I ask us to no longer neglect the things that are so horrible, that we speak out, we speak up, and we become the people that we believe we are, not just for us, but for generations and generations to come. Mr. Speaker, I ask that the first roll be open for co-authors on ACR 139.